My name is Lena Carter, and I'm 26 years old. 8 months ago, my parents handed the SUV my grandmother gave me to my older sister and told me she needed it more. Just like that. No discussion. No warning. No apology. They simply took my keys off the kitchen counter and told my sister to drive carefully. Then my mom looked at me and said the same sentence she'd been saying to me my entire life. Emily has 2 kids. You're single. You'll manage. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I didn't even ask them to give it back. I just stood there in my parents' driveway in Charlotte, North Carolina, watching the silver SUV my grandmother had given me disappear down the street with my sister behind the wheel. And in that moment, something inside me finally clicked. Not anger. Not even sadness. Just clarity. Because it wasn't really about the car. It never was. The car was just the latest thing my family had decided I didn't deserve. But what happened 3 months later at my grandmother's birthday dinner made everyone in that room realize they had made a very serious mistake. Especially my parents. Especially my sister. And especially me for thinking I had to stay quiet forever. But before I tell you how that night unfolded, if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you subscribe to Women Reddit Stories and turn on the bell so you never miss a new upload. Stories like this get posted here every week, and trust me, some of them are even wilder than mine. Now let me take you back to where all of this really started. Growing up, I was always the quiet one in my family. There were only 4 of us. My dad, my mom, my sister Emily, and me. Dad worked as a regional sales manager for a construction supply company. He traveled a lot when we were kids, which meant most of the time it was just Mom running the house. Emily was 3 years older than me. And from the moment we were little, she was the center of everything. She had Mom's blonde hair, Mom's bright smile, Mom's loud laugh that could fill an entire room. People always said they looked like twins. I took after Dad. Dark hair. Quieter personality. The kind of person who would rather listen than talk. And in our house, that difference mattered more than I realized at the time. When we were kids, if Emily wanted the bigger bedroom, she got it. Mom would smile at me and say, "Lena, you're more easygoing. You don't mind, right?" If Emily forgot to do her chores, guess who ended up doing them? Lena, you're already helping in the kitchen anyway. If Emily wanted to invite 5 friends over the same night I had plans with my own friends, well, those plans usually disappeared. Be flexible, Mom would say. That word followed me through my entire childhood. Flexible. At first I thought it meant I was mature. Later I realized it meant something very different. By the time I turned 25, I had built a life that didn't depend on my parents. I worked as a remote graphic designer, creating branding packages for small businesses and online startups. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid my bills and allowed me to rent a small apartment just outside downtown Charlotte. But to my parents, it didn't count as a real job. You sit at home on your laptop all day, Mom once said during a family dinner. Emily, on the other hand, had what Mom called a real life. She married her college boyfriend, Mark, at 23. By 25 she had 2 kids. A little boy named Jacob and a baby girl named Lily. Mom loved that. Loved it. Every family gathering turned into a celebration of Emily's life. Pictures of the kids. Stories about daycare. Discussions about minivans and school districts. Meanwhile, whenever someone asked me what I'd been doing lately, the conversation usually ended after 2 sentences. "Oh, still working online?" "Yes." "Well, that's nice." Then the attention would swing back to Emily. I had gotten used to it. Or at least I thought I had. Until my grandmother stepped in. My grandmother, Margaret Carter, had always been different from the rest of the family. She lived about 40 minutes outside Charlotte in a small brick house she'd owned for nearly 40 years. After my grandfather passed away, she stayed there alone. Everyone worried about her living by herself. But Grandma had a stubborn streak a mile wide. "I've lived here longer than any of you," she would say. "I'm not going anywhere." While the rest of my family visited her maybe once every couple of months, I called her every Sunday. Sometimes we talked for 10 minutes. Sometimes for an hour. She liked hearing about my work, the clients I was dealing with, the weird design requests people sent me. Once during one of those calls, she said something that stuck with me. "You notice things, Lena," she told me. "What do you mean?" I asked. "You watch people. Quietly. That's a powerful skill." I laughed at the time. But Grandma wasn't joking. And as it turned out, she had been watching our family a lot more closely than any of us realized. My 26th birthday came and went with very little fanfare. A cake at my parents' house. A few presents. Emily arrived late because Jacob had soccer practice. The evening felt exactly like every other family gathering. Predictable. Uneventful. Until we walked outside. Parked in the driveway was a silver Toyota Highlander, wrapped in an oversized red bow. I thought it was a joke at first. "Whose car is that?" I asked. Mom smiled like she had just performed the most generous act in human history. "Yours." My heart actually stopped. "What?" Dad handed me a set of keys. "Happy birthday, kiddo." I remember staring at those keys, completely stunned. I had been driving an old used sedan for years. Nothing fancy. Just something reliable enough to get me around. But this SUV was beautiful. Reliable. New. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something unfamiliar when standing with my family. Seen. Acknowledged. Grandma stood near the garage, watching quietly. When our eyes met, she gave me a small smile. Later that night, Mom casually mentioned something that should have raised questions. "Your grandmother helped with it," she said. "She thought it was time you had something nice." I didn't think much about that at the time. I just felt grateful. For the next 8 months, that SUV became a small symbol of independence in my life. I drove it to client meetings, road trips, Sunday visits to Grandma's house. Every time I got behind the wheel, I felt like maybe things with my family were finally changing. Maybe they were starting to see me differently. Then Emily's car broke down. And everything unraveled. 3 weeks before my grandmother's 75th birthday dinner, I stopped by my parents' house for Sunday lunch. As I pulled into the driveway, I immediately noticed something strange. My SUV wasn't where I had parked it the last time I visited. Instead, Emily's old minivan sat crooked near the garage. I walked inside. Mom was in the kitchen stirring a pot of soup. "Mom," I asked, "where's my car?" She didn't even look up. "Oh, Emily took it." I blinked. "Took it?" Her tone was casual. Dismissive. "Her van's in the shop. She needed something bigger for the kids. Borrowed. Just for a few days." That's what Mom said. A week passed. Then 2. And when I finally asked for it back, the answer I got was the same one I had heard my entire life. "Lena," Mom sighed over the phone, "Emily has 2 children. You work from home. You don't really need it." Then she said the word again. That word. Flexible. But what I didn't know yet was that my grandmother had been paying attention the entire time. And the dinner planned for her 75th birthday was about to become something none of us would ever forget. The dinner for my grandmother's 75th birthday was held at a restaurant called the Hawthorne Room in Uptown Charlotte. It was the kind of place that tried very hard to look effortless about being expensive. White tablecloths. Tall glass windows. Soft piano music drifted from somewhere near the bar. Mom had reserved a private dining room for the event. 40 people were invited, extended family, cousins I hadn't seen in years, a few of Grandma's old friends. The whole thing felt less like a birthday dinner and more like a formal family gathering. I arrived in an Uber. That part alone already felt strange. For 8 months, I had driven everywhere in that silver SUV. Grocery runs, work errands, visits to Grandma. But now, standing on the sidewalk outside the restaurant while the Uber drove away, I felt oddly out of place. Like I had lost something that belonged to me. As I walked toward the entrance, I saw it. My SUV. Parked 3 spaces away from the front door. The silver paint caught the glow from the streetlights, and I recognized it instantly. The same tiny scratch near the back bumper from when I had clipped a shopping cart months earlier. The same license plate. But something else had been added. A bright yellow "Baby on Board" sticker was now stuck to the rear window. I stood there for a second staring at it. Then the driver's door opened. Emily stepped out. She was balancing Lily on her hip while Mark climbed out of the passenger side with Jacob half asleep against his shoulder. Emily spotted me and waved. "Lena." "Hey." Her voice sounded cheerful. Normal. Like nothing unusual had happened. "Did you just get here?" she asked as she walked toward me. "Yeah," I said slowly. "Did you Uber?" The question landed like a pebble dropped into a still lake. I forced a small smile. "Yeah. Seemed convenient." "Right," she said brightly. "Ubers are great." For a moment I thought she might say something about the car. Maybe explain when she planned to return it. Maybe acknowledge that it was still technically mine. But she didn't. Instead, she adjusted Lily on her hip and said, "We should head in. Mom's been stressing about seating arrangements all afternoon." Mark gave me an awkward nod. Then the 3 of them walked inside. I stood there for another moment in the parking lot, looking at my SUV. My grandmother's gift. My name wasn't on the title, but for 8 months it had been mine. Now it had someone else's sticker. Someone else's car seats. Someone else's life inside it. I finally turned and walked into the restaurant. The private dining room buzzed with conversation. Crystal glasses clinked. Chairs scraped lightly across the polished floor. Grandma sat at the head of a long rectangular table, wearing a navy blue dress and a pearl necklace she'd owned for decades. Her silver hair was pinned neatly back, and even at 75 she carried herself with the same straight-backed posture she'd had when I was a child. When she saw me, her face lit up. "Lena." She opened her arms, and I walked over to hug her. "You look beautiful tonight," she said warmly. "Happy birthday, Grandma." "Thank you, sweetheart." Her eyes moved past me briefly. "Where's that lovely SUV you've been driving?" The question caught me off guard. Before I could answer, Mom's voice rang out from halfway down the table. "Oh, Lena gave it to Emily." The room went quiet for half a second. Mom smiled proudly, like she had just announced a generous act of charity. "Emily needed something reliable for the kids," she continued. Lena said she didn't mind. A few relatives murmured approvingly. "That's sweet. Such a thoughtful sister. Family helps family." I felt my stomach drop. I hadn't given anything away. No one had asked me. But at that moment, Mom had just rewritten the story in front of 40 people. Grandma's eyes slowly returned to me. "You gave it away?" she asked calmly. Her voice wasn't loud. But something about the tone made the room grow quieter. Mom laughed lightly. "Oh, Mom, don't make it sound dramatic." Lena understood Emily needed it more. Grandma didn't look at her. She kept her gaze fixed on me. "Did you give it away, Lena?" Every conversation at the table had stopped. Forks hovered above plates. Glasses paused halfway to lips. 40 sets of eyes shifted between my grandmother and me. Mom gave me a warning look. One of those looks she used when I was a kid that meant don't contradict me. For a moment, I almost stayed silent. That was the role I had always played in our family. The flexible one. The easygoing one. But something about the way Grandma was looking at me made it impossible to lie. No, I said quietly. The room went completely still. I didn't give it away. Mom's smile froze. What Lena means, she began quickly. Grandma raised a hand. Linda, she said calmly. My mother stopped talking. I'm asking Lena. She turned back to me. Then what happened? My heartbeat pounded in my ears. Emily borrowed it, I said slowly. She said her van was in the shop. Mom said it would only be for a week. And now? It's been 3 weeks. A ripple moved through the room. Mom stood up suddenly. This is a private family matter, she said tightly. We don't need to discuss it during a birthday dinner. Grandma set her fork down carefully. A $30,000 vehicle is not a small matter. Someone gasped softly at the table. Mom's face flushed red. Mother, please. You announced Lena's generosity to the entire room, Grandma replied calmly. If that statement isn't accurate, it should be corrected in the same room. Mom looked around the table. Every relative was watching now. Emily had gone pale. Mark stared down at his plate. Grandma folded her hands neatly in front of her. Linda, she said. Do you remember asking me for money last year? Mom froze. The silence stretched. Grandma continued. You came to my house 3 weeks before Lena's birthday. Her voice was calm. Precise. You told me you wanted to buy Lena a car. My breath caught. Mom shifted uncomfortably. This isn't the time. You said, Grandma continued, that Lena often felt overlooked in the family. Whispers began moving around the table. You said you wanted to do something meaningful for her. Mom's face had turned a shade of pale I had never seen before. Grandma leaned forward slightly. And I agreed. She paused. But only under one condition. The entire room held its breath. And you signed paperwork promising that the car would belong to Lena. No one else. Mom's lips parted. But no sound came out. Grandma turned her head slightly. Robert, she said to my uncle. Did you bring the folder I asked for? Uncle Robert reached down beside his chair and pulled out a thick manila envelope. My mother's face went completely white. The moment Uncle Robert pulled the manila envelope out from beside his chair, something in the room shifted. It wasn't loud. No one spoke. But you could feel it. Like the air pressure had suddenly dropped. My mother stared at the envelope the way someone might stare at a ticking bomb. Mother, she said quietly, her voice tight with strain. Whatever you're planning, this really isn't the time. Grandma didn't respond right away. She simply held out her hand. Robert placed the envelope into it. It looked completely ordinary. Plain beige paper. A metal clasp. But the way my mother's eyes followed it told me it contained something far more dangerous than paper. Grandma opened the clasp slowly. Deliberately. You had 3 weeks, Linda, she said calmly. My mom swallowed. I was going to talk to Lena. 3 weeks, Grandma repeated. You could have returned the car. You could have apologized. You could have corrected the story before tonight. She reached inside the envelope and pulled out several sheets of paper. But instead, she continued, placing them neatly across the white tablecloth, you announced to 40 people that Lena gave away her birthday gift. The documents spread out like evidence on a courtroom table. And I believe, Grandma said softly, the truth deserves the same audience. Everyone leaned forward. Even people at the far end of the table craned their necks. I caught a glimpse of official-looking forms. Logos. Government stamps. Grandma slid the first sheet toward Uncle Robert. Please read the first document. Robert adjusted his glasses. He glanced once at my mother before beginning. Vehicle registration, he said slowly. State of North Carolina. He scanned the page. Then his eyebrows lifted. Registered owner, he paused, squinting slightly. Margaret Carter. A wave of murmurs swept across the table. What? Wait, what? That can't be right. Mom's voice jumped in quickly. That's just for insurance purposes, she said sharply. Lots of people register vehicles in a parent's name. It simplifies taxes. Grandma raised one eyebrow. Does it? Then she turned back to Robert. Continue. Robert picked up the next document. This appears to be some type of agreement. His eyes moved across the page. And the expression on his face slowly changed. Confusion. Then recognition. Then something closer to disbelief. Grandma folded her hands. Please read it aloud. Mom made a strained sound. I really don't see why this needs to. Robert, Grandma repeated. The room had gone silent again. Robert cleared his throat. Mitchell Carter Family Trust Disbursement Agreement, he read. Dated April 12th of last year. He paused briefly. Then continued. I, Linda Carter, acknowledge receipt of $29,000 from the Carter Family Trust. Someone at the table whispered, 29,000? Robert kept reading. These funds are designated specifically for the purchase of a vehicle as a birthday gift for my daughter, Lena Carter. My pulse hammered in my ears. Robert flipped to the next paragraph. The vehicle purchased with these funds will remain registered under Margaret Carter but will serve as the sole property of Lena Carter for her personal use. My stomach dropped. I hadn't known any of this. Not one word. Robert's voice grew quieter as he read the final section. I agree that this vehicle cannot be transferred, sold, loaned, or reassigned to any other family member without the explicit permission of Lena Carter. He lowered the paper slowly. It's signed. He glanced at the bottom. Linda Carter. Then he looked up. And witnessed by Robert Carter. He blinked once. That's me. The room erupted into whispers. My mother had gone completely still. You told me it was standard trust paperwork, Robert said slowly. Mom's mouth opened. I didn't think. You didn't think it mattered? Grandma asked calmly. Mom's face had turned the color of chalk. That was just a formality. A formality, Grandma repeated softly. $29,000 from my trust. She gestured toward the papers. And a signed agreement promising the vehicle belonged solely to Lena. Across the table, Emily had started crying. Silent tears rolled down her cheeks as she stared at the documents. Mark kept his head down. Grandma turned slightly so her voice carried through the room. This was not a family vehicle, she said clearly. This was Lena's property. Her eyes settled on my mother. And you took it anyway. Mom's breathing had grown shallow. You're twisting things, she said. I thought Lena wouldn't mind. Grandma didn't react. Instead, she nodded toward the envelope. There's more. Robert pulled out another sheet. This one looked older. The paper slightly creased. This appears to be a handwritten note, he said. Mom made a soft, desperate sound. Mother. Read it. Robert looked down. And began. I promise that the car purchased with your gift will remain Lena's and Lena's alone. His voice slowed. I understand that Lena has sometimes felt overlooked in our family, and I want this gift to show her that she matters. The words hit me like a physical blow. Overlooked. Mom had written that. Robert continued. I will never take this vehicle from her or allow anyone else to use it without her permission. He finished quietly. Signed, Linda Carter. No one spoke. For a long moment, the room felt frozen. 40 people sitting in complete silence. Emily began crying harder now. "Mom," she whispered. "How could you?" Mom turned toward her. "You said Lena didn't care about the car." Emily's voice cracked. "I thought she agreed." Grandma looked at her calmly. "Did you ask her?" Emily hesitated. Mom said. "That wasn't my question." Grandma's tone sharpened slightly. "Did you ask Lena?" Emily looked down at the table. "No." Grandma nodded slowly. "Of course you didn't." Mark shifted uncomfortably beside her. "I'm sure this was all just a misunderstanding," he said carefully. "Maybe we can talk about it somewhere more private." Grandma laughed softly. The sound carried an edge. "Private?" She gestured around the room. "Your mother-in-law made a public announcement about Lena's generosity." Her eyes swept across the table. "This was made public." Her voice turned firm. "So the truth will be public too." She turned to Emily. "Madison." Emily sniffed. "My name is Emily." Grandma gave a small nod. "Then Emily." She extended her hand. "The keys." Emily froze. For a moment it looked like she might argue. But the weight of the entire room's attention was pressing down on her. Slowly, she reached into her purse. A moment later she placed my keychain into Grandma's hand. The tiny silver compass charm I had attached months ago swung gently under the restaurant lights. Grandma looked at it for a moment. Then she stood up and turned toward me. Grandma stood at the head of the table, holding my keychain between two fingers. The tiny silver compass charm swung gently under the restaurant lights. For a moment she didn't say anything. She simply looked at it. Then she turned toward Emily. "Come here." Emily wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand and slowly pushed her chair back. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor as she walked toward the head of the table. The entire room watched. Grandma held out her hand. "Give the keys to Lena." Emily hesitated. Not long. Just long enough for everyone to notice. Then she turned toward me. Her eyes were red, her mascara slightly smudged, and for the first time in my life she looked unsure. She walked the few steps down the length of the table. When she reached me, she placed the keys into my hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The metal felt warm from her palm. Familiar. "Mine." "My car," I said quietly. Emily nodded weakly. "I thought you said it was okay," she said. "I thought Mom had asked you." "You never called," I replied. Her shoulders sagged slightly. "I know." Grandma's voice cut gently through the moment. "Good." She sat down again. "And now we address the second issue." Mom groaned softly under her breath. "Mother, please." But Grandma was already looking directly at her. "Linda," she said calmly. "You owe your daughter an apology." Mom's face tightened. "I already apologized." "You said the word sorry," Grandma replied evenly. "That's not the same thing." Several relatives shifted in their seats. The tension in the room felt heavy enough to touch. Mom slowly stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor. She looked at me. Then briefly around the room. 40 witnesses. No escape. Her voice came out tight. "Lena, I apologize for the misunderstanding with the car." That was it. A thin technical statement. Nothing more. Grandma's eyes narrowed slightly. "A misunderstanding," she repeated. "Yes," Mom said quickly. "Emily needed reliable transportation for the kids, and I assumed Lena would understand. It wasn't meant to become such a big issue." Something inside me finally snapped into focus. For years I had waited for my mother to recognize what she did. To see me. To understand. But standing there in that restaurant, listening to her explanation, I realized something important. She never would. And for the first time in my life, that realization didn't hurt. It felt freeing. I stood up. The chair legs scraped softly behind me. Mom looked relieved for a split second, probably assuming I was about to smooth things over. That was the role I had always played. But I didn't smooth anything over. I held up the keys. My car is back, I said calmly. Yes, Mom said quickly. So this whole thing can finally be put behind us. No. The word stopped her cold. No. No, I repeated. The room went silent again. This isn't about the car anymore. Mom frowned. What are you talking about? I took a breath. For 26 years, every decision in this family has been made for me. Mom's face hardened. That's ridiculous. If Emily wanted something, I continued, you gave it to her. That's not. And if that meant I had to give something up, I said, you told me to be flexible. The word hung in the air. Grandma watched quietly from the head of the table. Mom crossed her arms. You've always been flexible, she said defensively. You're the easygoing one. No, I said. I was the quiet one. Mom opened her mouth to argue. But I kept talking. You never asked if I wanted the smaller bedroom. You never asked if I wanted to give up my plans. You never asked if I was okay with Emily taking my car. My voice stayed calm. Steady. I'm not flexible anymore. Mom stared at me. You're being dramatic. Maybe. I shrugged slightly. But from now on, if a decision involves me, my time, or my property, you ask me first. Her expression darkened. I'm your mother. And I'm your daughter. The room was completely silent now. No one even pretended to eat anymore. You don't get to decide things for me anymore, I said. Mom looked stunned. For the first time I could remember, she didn't immediately have a response. Grandma leaned back in her chair slowly. A small smile touched her lips. That, she said quietly, is exactly what I was hoping to hear. Mom turned toward her. You planned this. Grandma shrugged slightly. I planned to make sure Lena wasn't ignored again. Mom's voice rose. You humiliated me in front of the entire family. Grandma's expression didn't change. You humiliated your daughter first. Mom turned back toward me. So that's it, she snapped. You're going to hold a grudge over a car? I shook my head. No. I'm setting boundaries. The word seemed to confuse her even more. What boundaries? For starters, I said calmly, you don't give away my things. A few relatives chuckled nervously. Mom flushed red. Grandma folded her hands. There is also another matter we should address. Mom's head snapped up. What now? The Carter family trust. Several people around the table straightened. Everyone in our extended family knew about the trust. My grandfather had created it decades earlier to help future generations with things like education, homes, or emergencies. Until now, the money had always been distributed through his children. Mom. Uncle Robert. Aunt Diane. Grandma looked around the table. For years, she said, I have allowed my children to request funds on behalf of their families. Mom nodded quickly. Yes, exactly. That system, Grandma continued, ends tonight. Mom blinked. What? Grandma's voice stayed calm. From now on, each grandchild will speak to me directly regarding trust matters. A ripple moved through the room. You're bypassing us? Mom asked. I'm eliminating unnecessary filters. Mom shook her head. That's ridiculous. Grandma raised an eyebrow. Is it? She gestured toward the documents still spread across the table. Tonight demonstrated exactly why that system needs to change. Mom's face went pale again. Grandma's voice carried clearly through the room. No more parents deciding which child deserves what. Several cousins exchanged glances. Uncle Robert nodded slowly. That actually sounds fair. Aunt Diane agreed quietly. I think it does too. Mom looked around the table. The control she had always assumed she held was slipping. And she could feel it. You can't just change everything overnight, she said weakly. Grandma smiled. Watch me. The room fell silent again. And in that moment, something fundamental shifted in our family. The balance of power had changed. Mom was no longer the gatekeeper. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't standing in anyone's shadow. The dinner ended less than 30 minutes after that announcement. Not officially. No one stood up and declared the evening over. The waiters still brought out Grandma's birthday cake. Someone even started singing Happy Birthday. But the energy in the room had changed. The conversations were quieter. More cautious. Like everyone was still trying to process what had just happened. Mom and Dad were the first to leave. They stood up almost immediately after dessert was served. Mom gave Grandma a stiff hug. Then she turned toward me. For a moment it looked like she might say something. Instead, she simply nodded once and walked out of the room. Dad followed behind her, offering a brief good night, everyone. Emily and Mark stayed a little longer. Jacob was half asleep in his chair, his head drooping forward every few minutes. Lily was already passed out in Mark's arms. Emily avoided looking at me for most of the remaining dinner. When she finally stood to leave, she hesitated near the door. Then she turned back toward the table. Her eyes found mine. I really am sorry, she said quietly. I nodded. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it wasn't anger either. Just acknowledgement. Then she left. One by one, the rest of the relatives began gathering their things. Uncle Robert shook my hand before he headed out. Welcome to the club, he said with a crooked grin. What club? The Not the Favorite Club. I laughed for the first time all evening. We meet on alternating holidays. Aunt Diane hugged me tightly. You did the right thing tonight, she said. Standing up like that takes courage. I didn't feel very brave. Most brave people don't, she replied. Eventually the room emptied. The restaurant staff began quietly clearing plates and folding napkins. Grandma was the last one still sitting at the table. She looked relaxed. Almost amused. Well, she said finally, that was entertaining. I laughed again. You call that entertaining? Oh, absolutely. She stood up slowly and slipped on her coat. Let's go outside. The cool evening air felt refreshing after the heavy tension of the dining room. The city lights of Charlotte glowed across the street. And there it was. My SUV. Parked exactly where Emily had left it. For a moment, I just stood there staring at it. Grandma walked up beside me. Feels different now, doesn't it? She said. Yeah. She glanced at me. You're not upset with me for making a scene? No. I shook my head. I'm grateful. She smiled slightly. Good. We walked over to the car together. I ran my fingers along the door handle. Just like earlier that evening. But this time the feeling was completely different. Ownership. Relief. Closure. Grandma, I said quietly, why did you keep the title in your name? She leaned against the hood of the car. Because I know your mother. That answer didn't surprise me. I had a feeling, she continued, that if the car were fully under her control, something like this might happen. So you planned all this? Not exactly. She smiled faintly. I simply prepared. I opened the driver's door and looked inside. The car seats were still there. The bright yellow baby on board sticker still clung to the rear window. Grandma noticed me staring at it. You can remove that later, she said. Yeah. We stood there for a moment in comfortable silence. Then she turned to me. I'm proud of you. The words caught me off guard. For what? For finally speaking. I shrugged. It took me 26 years. Some lessons take longer than others. She adjusted her coat collar against the evening breeze. You know why I recognized what was happening with your mother? I looked at her. Why? Because I was the flexible one too. I blinked. What? When I was growing up, she said, your great-grandmother favored my older sister. I hadn't known that. Everything revolved around her, Grandma continued. Her needs, her opinions, her future. And you? I was expected to adapt. The word landed with familiar weight. Flexible. Grandma gave a small laugh. I became very good at it. What changed? She smiled softly. Your grandfather. I leaned against the car beside her. He noticed, she said. He told me one day that I was wasting my life trying to make other people comfortable. That sounds like Grandpa. Oh, it absolutely does. She looked out across the streetlights. He made me promise something. What? That I would never shrink myself again. Her eyes returned to mine. I kept that promise. The meaning behind her words settled slowly into place. And now you're making sure I do the same thing, I said. Exactly. She reached over and squeezed my hand. You deserve to take up space, Lena. For a long time, I had believed the opposite. That being quiet was easier. That letting things go kept the peace. But standing there next to my grandmother, I realized something important. Keeping the peace had only made me invisible. Grandma stepped back from the car. Well, she said briskly, I should head home before your aunt calls to interrogate me about tonight. I laughed. That's definitely going to happen. Oh, I'm counting on it. She gave me a quick hug. Drive safe. I will. Then she paused. One more thing. Yeah? Don't ever let anyone call you flexible again. I smiled. I won't. She nodded approvingly and walked toward her car. I watched her drive away before climbing into my SUV. The engine started smoothly. Familiar. Comforting. I drove home with the windows down, the cool night air rushing inside. For the first time in a long while, my mind felt quiet. Not because the problem had been solved, but because something had finally changed. The next 2 weeks passed in almost complete silence. Mom didn't call. Emily didn't text. Dad sent one short message that simply said, "Hope you're doing okay." I replied with a thumbs-up emoji. Then one Tuesday evening, my phone lit up. Mom was calling. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. "Hello?" "Lena," she said. Her voice sounded carefully neutral. "I think we need to talk." I leaned back in my chair. "Okay. I don't want this family falling apart over a car." A familiar phrase. A familiar tactic. "It wasn't about the car," I said calmly. She sighed. Things just got out of hand. There it was again. Not an apology. Just a reframing. "Maybe we can meet and clear the air," she continued. "Maybe." There was a short pause. Then she said something that made my chest tighten. "By the way, has your grandmother talked to you about the trust?" For a moment I didn't answer. I already knew where this conversation was going. Mom hadn't called to repair our relationship. She hadn't called to apologize. She had called because something important had changed at that dinner. The trust. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't the one controlling it. "Why are you asking?" I said. Mom's voice stayed carefully calm. "Oh, you know. Just curious if she's mentioned anything about how things will work now." I leaned back in my chair. My apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of my laptop on the desk beside me. If you want to know about the trust, I said evenly, you should ask Grandma. I am asking you. That's not the same thing. She sighed again. You're being difficult. The old phrase. I almost laughed. No, I said. I'm setting a boundary. There was a long pause. I could almost hear her trying to figure out how to steer the conversation back into familiar territory. Look, she said finally. I just want to understand what your grandmother is planning. Then talk to her. She can be stubborn. She learned from you. Mom didn't appreciate that. Lena. Her voice sharpened slightly. I'm trying to fix things here. No, I replied calmly. You're trying to gather information. Another pause. You're being unfair. That's possible. But if the only reason you're calling is to figure out whether Grandma plans to give me money, I said, then this conversation is over. Her tone shifted again. Softer. Of course that's not the only reason. Then what's the reason? She hesitated. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Good night, Mom, I said. Wait. But I had already hung up. I sat there for a few seconds staring at the phone in my hand. 6 months earlier, that conversation would have ruined my entire evening. Now it barely affected me. Because something inside me had changed. I wasn't waiting for my mother's approval anymore. 2 weeks passed. Then 3. Life slowly returned to normal. Work projects. Grocery runs. Sunday visits with Grandma. My SUV was finally back to the way it had been before Emily borrowed it. The car seats were gone. The sticker was gone. And the tiny compass charm once again hung from my keychain. One afternoon I was finishing up a logo project for a new coffee shop client when my phone buzzed. A text from Emily. Can we meet for coffee? I stared at the message for a long time. Part of me wanted to ignore it. The peace I had found after the restaurant dinner felt fragile. But another part of me knew something important. Emily hadn't actually been the one who made most of those decisions growing up. Mom had. Emily had simply lived inside the system that favored her. I typed back. Okay. We met 2 days later at a small cafe near my apartment. Emily was already there when I arrived. She looked different than usual. Her hair was pulled back into a messy ponytail. Dark circles sat under her eyes. She looked tired. Thanks for coming, she said quietly. I sat down across from her. No problem. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she exhaled slowly. I've been doing a lot of thinking since Grandma's birthday dinner. That makes 2 of us. She nodded. I owe you a real apology. I didn't say anything. I should have asked before taking the car, she continued. But that's not the only thing. Her fingers tightened around her coffee cup. I've always just assumed things. What things? That Mom was right. About what? About you being fine with everything. I leaned back slightly. You never wondered why I was always the one giving things up? She shook her head. Not really. Her honesty was blunt. Painfully blunt. But I should have, she added quickly. I should have noticed. Why didn't you? She looked down. Because it benefited me. The words hung between us. I was the favorite, she said quietly. It was easy not to question it. I studied her face. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't trying to justify anything. She simply looked ashamed. I didn't even think about how that might feel for you, she said. I just assumed you didn't mind. That assumption cost me a lot over the years. I know. Her eyes filled with tears. And I'm sorry. For a moment neither of us spoke. Finally I said something I had never said to her before. I don't need you to be perfect, Emily. She looked up. I just need you to ask. Her eyes softened slightly. I can do that. We sat there talking for nearly an hour. About childhood. About the way Mom had always handled everything. About how easy it had been for Emily to accept that version of reality. When we finally stood up to leave, she hugged me. Not the quick, polite hugs we usually exchanged during holidays. A real hug. I'm trying, she said. I know. It wasn't a full repair. But it was a start. Over the next few months, things between us slowly changed. Emily began texting me occasionally. Not about favors. Not about things she needed. Just normal conversations. And every Sunday afternoon, I drove my SUV out to my grandmother's house. She loved sitting in her backyard garden with a cup of tea. Rose bushes lined the wooden fence. Wind chimes hung near the back porch. One afternoon, as we were trimming a few branches from one of the roses, she said something that stuck with me. You seem different. Different how? Happier. I thought about that for a moment. Maybe I am. She clipped one of the stems carefully. Standing up for yourself tends to do that. I smiled. You knew exactly what you were doing that night, didn't you? She gave me an innocent look. Me? Yes, you. She laughed. Well, maybe a little. You planned the whole thing. I prepared, she corrected again. You delivered. I thought about that. For most of my life, I had believed that speaking up would make everything worse. Now I realized something important. Staying quiet had been the real problem all along. Grandma handed me the garden shears. Your turn. I started trimming a few leaves. You know, she said thoughtfully, families are complicated things. That's one way to put it. But sometimes, she continued, all it takes to change the entire dynamic is one person deciding they're done being invisible. I looked at her. You think that's what happened? She smiled. I know it is. I set the shears down. And what if Mom never changes? Grandma shrugged. Then she never changes. That answer surprised me. You're okay with that? I'm okay with you not waiting for it anymore. Her words settled quietly in my mind. For years I had waited for my mother to finally see me. To recognize the imbalance. To admit it. But maybe that wasn't necessary. Maybe the only thing that really mattered was that I saw it now. And once you see something clearly, you can't go back to pretending it isn't there. Grandma poured 2 cups of tea and handed one to me. You know what your biggest mistake used to be? She asked. What? You thought being the peaceful one meant giving up your voice. She tapped the table gently. Peace doesn't come from silence. I nodded slowly. And where does it come from? She smiled. From boundaries. That lesson stayed with me long after that afternoon ended. Because it turned out Grandma wasn't the only one who had been learning something from that birthday dinner. I had been learning too. And the final test of those lessons came sooner than I expected. 6 months after Grandma's birthday dinner, my life looked surprisingly different. Not dramatically different. I still lived in the same apartment. I still worked the same remote graphic design job. My mornings still started with coffee and client emails. But the way I moved through my life had changed. The biggest difference wasn't the car. It wasn't the trust. It wasn't even the confrontation at the restaurant. The biggest difference was something much quieter. I had stopped shrinking. For most of my life, I had made myself smaller so everyone else in my family could stay comfortable. If Emily needed something, I stepped aside. If Mom made a decision, I went along with it. If something felt unfair, I told myself it wasn't worth the conflict. But after that night at the restaurant, something inside me finally reset. I had seen the truth clearly. And once you see something like that, you can't unsee it. My relationship with Mom became careful. That was the best word for it. We still spoke occasionally. Short phone calls. The occasional family text thread. But there were new lines in place now. Invisible boundaries that hadn't existed before. She noticed them too. The first time she tried to cross one, it happened during a Sunday dinner at my parents' house about 2 months after the birthday dinner. Emily and her kids were there. Dad was grilling in the backyard. Mom was setting plates on the dining table. At one point she said casually, "Emily might need help picking up Jacob from daycare next week. You're home during the day anyway." 6 months earlier, I would have automatically said yes. This time I paused. "I can help if she asks me." Mom looked up from the plates. "She's busy." "So am I." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "You work from home?" "Yes." "And that's still work?" The silence that followed wasn't hostile. Just unfamiliar. Mom nodded slowly. "I'll tell her to call you." It was a small moment. But it mattered. Because it meant the old automatic expectations were starting to shift. Emily and I were rebuilding things too. Slowly. Carefully. But genuinely. She had kept her promise about asking instead of assuming. Sometimes it was small things. "Do you mind watching the kids for an hour? Can I borrow your ladder this weekend?" Simple requests. Normal conversations. Things that probably should have existed between us years ago. One evening we met for dinner after work. Jacob and Lily were staying with Mark's parents for the night, which meant Emily actually looked relaxed for once. We talked about everything from work to parenting to childhood memories. At one point she said something that stuck with me. "You know what I realized after that dinner?" "What?" "I never questioned anything growing up." "What do you mean?" "Mom handled everything," she said. "Who got what? Who needed help? Who deserved what? And you just trusted her judgment." "Exactly." She stirred her drink slowly. I didn't realize how much power she had over all of us until Grandma took it away. I nodded. That night changed a lot. It really did. Emily looked at me thoughtfully. "You know, I used to think you were the lucky one." I laughed. "Really?" "Yeah. You never got pulled into Mom's expectations the way I did." I considered that. Maybe. But being invisible isn't exactly lucky either. She winced slightly. "Fair point." We both smiled. For the first time in a long time, our conversations felt balanced. Not perfect. But honest. Dad remained. Dad. Neutral. He had always been that way. The kind of person who preferred calm over confrontation. Part of me used to resent that. Now I understood it better. Some people don't lead change. They simply adapt once it happens. And then there was Grandma. Every Sunday afternoon, I drove out to her house. My SUV parked in the same gravel driveway where I had first learned to drive as a teenager. We would sit in her backyard garden. Drink tea. Talk about life. Sometimes about family. Sometimes about completely random things. One afternoon as we were watching a pair of birds hopping along the fence, she said something thoughtful. "You know what the most interesting part of all this has been?" "What?" "You." I laughed. "What about me?" "You didn't become bitter." I hadn't thought about that. Was that an option? "Oh, absolutely." She sipped her tea. Many people would have used that dinner as ammunition for the rest of their lives. Why would I do that? Because resentment is easier than growth. I considered that. Maybe. But it wouldn't solve anything. Grandma smiled. Exactly. She set her cup down and looked directly at me. "You didn't win because you got the car back." "I didn't?" "No. You won because you found your voice." Her words stayed with me long after that afternoon. Because she was right. The car had never really been the point. It was just the moment everything finally became visible. The imbalance. The assumptions. The silence. Now I was 27. I still had my apartment. I still had my work. I still had my SUV with the tiny compass charm hanging from the keys. But the most important thing I had now was something I didn't have before. Boundaries. My family had learned something that night at Grandma's birthday dinner. I wasn't the flexible one anymore. I was the one who expected to be asked. And surprisingly, once that expectation became clear, people started respecting it. Even Mom. Not perfectly. But enough. Because sometimes the biggest change in a family doesn't come from forcing everyone else to be different. Sometimes it comes from one person refusing to stay invisible. And if you're watching this right now and you've ever felt like the overlooked one in your own family, like the one who always has to give in, the one who's expected to stay quiet, I want you to remember something my grandmother told me. Being peaceful doesn't mean being silent. You deserve to be heard. You deserve to be asked. And you deserve to take up space in your own life. That was the lesson my grandmother taught me the night she stood up for me in that restaurant. And it's a lesson I'll carry for the rest of my life. If this story resonated with you, make sure you subscribe to Women Reddit Stories and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next one. Stories like this come out every week, and you never know which one might remind you that your voice matters too. And before you go, I'd love to hear from you. What boundary in your life do you wish you had set sooner? Let me know in the comments. Until next time, take care of yourself. You deserve it.